Hello, friends. Welcome to the Wake Up with Gratitude podcast. I'm your host, Julie Boyer, and we're doing a very special event for the month of November. Every day, I'm sharing with you a different way to practice gratitude, as November is traditionally known as the month of gratitude. As we spend these last 10 days together, I encourage you to look back on what you've learned about gratitude this month and ask yourself, which of these gratitude practices do I want to incorporate into my life going forward? I do have a favor to ask. If you've been following along over the past few weeks and have gained something from these episodes, would you take a quick moment and give the show a rating? You can give the podcast a 5-star rating through the Apple Podcast app on your iPhone. Or if you're using Spotify, all you have to do is click right on the front screen of the podcast and give it a rating there as well. Thanks so much for taking time to rate the podcast. Now let's start today's gratitude episode. We're getting close to the end of our 30 Ways to Practice Gratitude in November, and today I wanted to invite you to do something a little bit more challenging with your gratitude practice. I'm not sure if you caught the title of this episode or not, but what I'm asking is, what's something you're grateful for about the pandemic? These past few years have been unprecedented in our lifetime. I believe we're still in this pandemic. It's not really over yet, and depending on what country you live in, you might find that you're much more in this pandemic than ever before. I think it's important to address what we've been through over the past couple of years and look for things that we are grateful for that has come out of these really difficult times. And some of these challenging times are still continuing, so we need our gratitude practices to keep us going. So when you think back to March of 2020, write down what your life looked like at that point. Perhaps looking back at some images on your camera roll or at some of your journals to get an idea of what life was like before the pandemic. I encourage you to work your way through the last few years and find things that you're grateful for that might not have come into your life had there not been a global pandemic. The reason this is so important is that I find that it's much more easy to complain about all the ways that life has changed since the pandemic began, instead of focusing on the ways that life has changed for the better. And some of us will never go back to our old ways. I know that for me, the pandemic didn't directly cause me to go into burnout. However, the extra work that I was doing online, the courses that I took, the extra workload I was taking on, and all of the stress of keeping myself and my family healthy, all that combined contributed to my own personal burnout and changed the way that I do business and care for myself. I thought that I was doing a good job of self-care. It's something that I've been talking about for many years in my business and on my podcast. That's actually how the podcast began. The podcast began with 30 Days of Self-Love, which was 25 interviews that I did with different people in my life, asking them how they took care of themselves and expressed self-love. I thought that after doing this, I would be much better able to take care of myself. And interestingly, my podcast launched only a few months before the global pandemic. It was good to have these different strategies in place, but I'm sure, like many of you, I didn't take care of myself for the first 6 to 8 months of going through the pandemic. This is a time that will be written about in the history books. And so I invite you this week to reflect back on this time and take a look of what has changed for you and your family. How can you find ways to be grateful for what this pandemic has brought into our lives? Things have changed permanently. We won't be going back to a world pre-pandemic. What I want us to do is focus on our gratitude practices going forward so that whatever challenges may come in the next few years or even the next decade, we've got a solid foundation of gratitude to help us get through it. I'll see you tomorrow for day 29. This concludes today's gratitude practice. Thanks for joining me, and I hope you take a moment to implement something you've learned today. I have a favor to ask. Would you mind rating and reviewing this podcast? Doesn't matter which podcast app you're using, every rating helps other people to find this podcast and help them make their decision when choosing which podcast to listen to. I appreciate your support, friends, and and thanks so much for taking the time to listen and rating the podcast. I'll be back tomorrow with another way to practice gratitude.